Hi, everyone. Let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. This is going to be your lecture for Chapter 1 of SOC 205, or Sexualities and Social Issues. So we're going to go over Chapter 1 of the textbook today. I'll probably do this in a, because there's so much terminology in this particular set of lectures, that I'll probably go ahead and pop this into two different lectures, or part 1 and part 2. That way it gives you guys a little bit easier time going back and finding something you may need. I've also attached the lecture slides themselves to the module page, so that way you can go back and just find the lecture slides if you want those. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. All right, so sociosexuality looks at sexuality not just as a personal identity, but looks at it more broadly as a way in which we interact with the social world. Okay, so anytime you're talking about a sociology course, you're going to be talking about society and person, or society and interaction, or person and interactions with other members of society, right? So there's an interactionary kind of situation here at work. And so this is no different. When we talk about sociology of sexuality, we're not talking about it in an interpersonal sphere of these are just my likes, my interests, my desires, my preferences, right? But we're also talking about how those preferences shape the way in which you walk through society, and the way in which society imprints understandings or assumptions on you, and or how those lead to discriminations or oppressions. Okay, so we're going to talk about how society, or how sexuality is political, how sexuality is shaped by the society and the culture in which you live in. So your options are based on, essentially, and even the language you use for those options are based on what you are presented with or lack of presentation with, right? So like, we have different language now than we do for specific sexualities, say in the 1920s. Those lack of terminologies, or change in terminologies and change in understandings, came with a cultural shift, and this shift to increase visibility of specific identities, this shift to increase maybe cultural understandings. That doesn't mean that these kind of desires or personal feelings towards other persons weren't there to begin with. It just means that we have shaped culturally how we view those, how we label those, if we have labels and words and terminologies for those, and kind of how we interact with each other within that societal context, if that makes sense. And in that, we're going to kind of talk about how sexuality is socially constructed. And we talk about this within our gender courses too. And we talk about this within, when we talk about race, when we talk about a lot of different things, class, any of those identity markers that come within a hierarchical structure, or that structure that says, hey, this is kind of that normal, this is that thing that we have deemed to be most valuable in society, whether or not that is the norm or not. That's kind of that hierarchy dictates kind of how we understand our place in the world and how other people place us in the world. Okay. And so by socially constructed, we mean that nothing is stagnant. So you're gonna, if you looked at what it meant to be in a, let's see here. If we looked at what it meant to be gay, or even the term gay, cross-culturally, even in the world today, we didn't change historical or not historical. We just looked today and we picked maybe 10 cultures across the world. Their way of thinking about that particular identity, about how valuable it is, about its origins, about its naturality, about its even maybe spirituality, all of those characteristics are going to shift depending on what culture you're in, depending on what culture you're talking to, right? So in the US, being gay is still considered a deviant sexual construction. It is still considered not the norm. It is still considered to be stigmatized. Now, less so than maybe at other points in historically in the US. However, it is still there. And a lot of that stems down to religion. It stems down to core understandings of naturality. Aside from that, if you go and look at other cultures, there are other cultures in the world that consider gay and queer people to be of the most spiritual, of the most valuable. They are, while still not the majority, those minority populations are considered to be incredibly valuable. And that difference comes out of cultural connotations. And so when we talk about sexuality being socially constructed, what we're talking about is that difference, right? That because there's not this stagnant understanding of this, because there's not a stagnant amount of this, because there's not stagnant language for this, or even having or not having of terms, and that how we view those things changes and varies based on place, time, age group, institution you're in, all of these situations, that based on where you are in society, that changes how you look at this. And that's what we mean by socially constructed. We're essentially talking about that difference. Okay. And that's again, I am not saying that, especially as a queer person, I'm not going to tell you that being queer is wrong in any sense. And you will never hear that out of this class. And sociology's job is not to label good, bad, otherwise. It is to talk about the difference in understandings of sexuality based on the perspectives in which a person may have, or how they are interacting with their own society, or how the society is interacting with them. And that's what we're going to talk about a lot in this class. And so we're also going to talk about how sexuality is socially controlled. So we talked about the very beginning of this book, why they started with this particular topic. I'm not entirely sure, but they, I guess, wanted something to pop off the pages. And so they started this conversation with sex robots and that moral conundrum that seems to be happening, and that ethical debate about where these lines are with artificial intelligence, and where laws need to be drawn, and where social morals need to be drawn, and all the different societies that are kind of playing with these ideas at this juncture, right? And this is where we get into talking about kind of how sexuality is socially controlled, right? We put rules, norms, social stigmas, social sanctions on people to control their sexual behavior. And in some ways, that's to decrease the harm that is done to others. So when we talk about laws protecting against sexual violence, right? Those things are to socially control that sexuality, but it's also to elicit the ability to not be able to control others or to harm others within your own sexual preferences. And those things are not necessarily, again, this is not a moral judgment about social control. It's about how social control is used to create different situations, to create laws, to create social morals, to create social stigma, to create oppression. And so we're going to talk about kind of all those things as we run through this course. We're also going to talk about how sexuality intersects with other identity markers. So we're going to talk about sexuality and race. We're going to talk about sexuality and gender. We're going to talk about sexuality and class. We're going to talk about sexuality and nationality, geography, these kinds of things. Why? And while this class is mostly US focused, it will have a lot of boxes, a lot of little pieces of transnationality in there so that you can kind of have conversations or think about how those things change culturally within the globe, because we do live in a more global economy, and we need to kind of have those kind of conversations. But so that one probably will be focused on a little less than some of the other ones, but understanding these intersections again helps us understand how society interacts with us and we interact with society. I'm hoping there's a theme that's being caught on here. And then we're going to talk about how sexuality is thought about or utilized and or discriminated against within specific institutions. So we're going to talk about education. We're going to talk about things like the workplace. We're going to talk about the family. We're going to talk about religion. We're going to talk about different institutions, social institutions that we have, and how those things dramatically vary on your life circumstances depending on your sexuality. All right, so we're gonna move on. We're going to start with some terms. Again, I'm going to get through these terms and then I'm going to end part 1 and then I'll get into some more terms for part 2. But these terms are going to just be kind of some core basic terms. I'm going to get a little more in depth with you because in some cases, the definitions that the book gives needs a little more. And again, that will probably be addressed hopefully within this text a little bit later. But even if it doesn't, we're gonna talk through a little bit more because it's important. And how we use language is going to be very, very, very important in this class, because the language that is used by this community and by persons that identify in these ways needs to be respected. And that is something that is a goal within this class, is how we understand language and how that language can be utilized to create that, again, that social control, those social sanctions, those oppressive forces. And so we're going to talk about language in very particular ways when we talk about this class. So we're going to talk with sexual orientation first, because again, sexuality and sexual orientation are at the basis root of this class. So the book defines this as referring to an individual's identity based on their enduring or continuing sexual attractions, and may include behaviors and a membership into a community of others who share similar attractions. So when we talk about our sexual orientation, generally we talk about it as an identity that we claim. So sexual orientation is something that you might be able to fill a box out on when it comes to like the census, or when it comes to other social surveys, or when you're filling it out at the doctor's office. Occasionally, I've seen that. But it's something that you ascribe to yourself. It's not as much something that other people describe to you, because you're referring to your own identity based on your behaviors, your actions, the way you think. Okay. It is changeable across the life force. So when it talks about enduring or continuing sexual attractions, that does not make it concrete. It does not mean that it doesn't change. It doesn't have fluidity. It doesn't have space for adding, subtracting, experimenting, having experiences with, any of those kind of ideas. Just because one claims a particular identity also doesn't mean that they don't have interactions that usually go outside of that definition, whether that definition may not entail. Okay, because our sexuality changes and it varies. You're not going to want the same things within even if you were a heteronormative monogamous relationship for the duration of your adult life. The sexual things that you may need or the physical preferences you may have are very likely to change from your young or early teens when you start having sex to the 60s, 70s, 80s, when you may be slowing down in that process. So those things are going to dramatically change. And so understanding that sexuality is fluid within the life force is going to help us kind of understand that overarching conversation around fluidity that we're going to have when we talk about sexuality. And it also, then again, this is a wide range of sexual attractions, but it also includes romantic attractions. Your sexual orientation generally also talks about who you would want to be romantically involved with, not just sexually involved with. And so in some ways, even though there's not a term for romantic orientation, it's lumped into this sexual orientation definition. And that's an important distinction, because you can be asexual and still have a sexual orientation, right? Which seems contradictory, but that's why I want to make that clarification. All right, so next we're going to talk about sexuality. Sexuality is one's sexual desires, erotic attractions, and sexual behaviors, or the potential for these physical acts and emotional intimacies that are intended to be pleasurable and that are embedded within a larger socially constructed body of meanings. Okay, so again, this is just talking about how sexuality is socially constructed and how it is made up of someone's desires, attractions, behaviors that have these, that are intended to be and increase some kind of pleasurable moment, or encapsulate some kind of thing within romantic and sexual encounters. So we're going to keep going because that definition pretty much covered that. We're going to talk about heterosexuality, which is, again, being what we would call straight more often than not, and homosexuality, which we're going to be, which we're going to more generally consider the term gay, but we're going to talk a little bit about what these things mean. So heterosexuality is the term for when one's romantic partner or sexual attractions are directed at members of the opposite sex. This, before we get into any other parts of this definition, this claims a sexual binary, which means that there are just male bodies and female bodies. It discludes a wide variety of intersex individuals. It discludes how gender plays a role in this and what it means when one's sex and one's gender do not align. And so I hesitate and want to draw attention to the sex binary that is being used in some of these definitions, because as we know, there is a range of sex characteristics that include intersex individuals that make up 1.7% of the population roughly. And so we don't want to disclude them and just ignore that they exist. We also don't want to ignore the fact that one's gender and one's sex don't always align, and that those can also be, that a trans woman can be straight with a cis male and that still be a heterosexual relationship, even though that trans woman's sex assigned at birth may have been male. And so we want to communicate that that sex binary is not always distinguishable within this relation or within this sexuality, and that, again, encounters outside of being straight or outside of that particular ideologies can be included within heterosexuality. So again, this term is also coined as straight. There's not always the case for that sexual binary. It also includes straight trans persons with or without a transition, and that there is fluidity again within that term. So that's, again, just talking about how you can have experiences outside of that heterosexual dynamic and still be considered straight mainstreamly, or consider yourself straight as a human. So this might include, say, a young woman going out and having fun at a bar or something and making out with another woman. That does not take away that straight identity, but it could allow them some fluidity within it. And so really just having and making sure that we're painting a picture that is not that these rigid lines between sexualities, because when we start making rigid lines, we tend to lack boxes for a lot of humans. And so we need to make sure that we're understanding that fluidity within every one of these definitions. All right. So homosexuality, which is when those feelings are primarily directed at individuals of the same sex. And again, this is that same sexual binary that is inaccurate. And I will talk about that again multiple times throughout this course, I have no doubt. It's an overarching term meant for both women and men. So again, gay also has that same thing. It can be used for men or women. However, traditionally and historically, it was talked about as being men attracted to men, and lesbians were talked about women attracted to women. Now, again, because we have branched out on our understandings of gender and of that nature, we also have expanded that term to mean a more wide variety of relationships. And historically, homosexuality was also, because we were taught about a sexuality binary, which we will talk about in the next part of this lecture, that all things queer or related to not being straight fell under this homosexuality category historically. Now, that is not the case. However, again, reiterating that lots of things fell into lots of different boxes depending on the cultural context that you There is a lot of negative connotation, cultural connotation at this point in our history to the term homosexual, and that is not one we will be using in this class to identify a specific person. You can talk about them as being gay, but I would not like anyone to use the term homosexual in reference to a specific person. If you would like to refer to homosexuality, that is perfectly fine because that is a definition for a specific type of sexuality. But I do not want you to call someone a homosexual because that has negative connotations and at this juncture has been considered a slur. It's also not just about sex, but it's also about gender. So again, to trans men or to being trans does not negate you from this terminology, or your sexuality can be separate from your gender. So understanding that there's some play there. Before queer was reclaimed as the term that was an umbrella over all things historically not straight. Again, homosexuality was that mark. So these are just kind of things to think about as we talk about terminology, because language is complicated and we love to have multiple terms for multiple things or for similar things. And so as we work through some of these ideologies, again, depending on where you are from as a student, you may have heard very different terminology or have experience with a lot of different terms as they differently than they are talked about in this book, or I'm going to talk about them. So we're going to move to the next thing. We're going to talk about asexuality and pansexuality. So asexuality is broadly defined as having no sexual attraction at all or being indifferent to sexual activity. A few caveats here. They can be asexual without being aromantic. So aromantic also means that they have no romantic desires or romantic attractions to any human. You can be aromantic and asexual. That is possible. And even within those, you can be in a relationship. It just means that that priority or that desire for you is not strong, or is not necessarily something that you need or want, but it might be something that you do because you care about somebody else anyway. Again, you can be asexual without being aromantic. So you can be romantically attracted to somebody and not sexually attracted to them and still be in that relationship and still be sexually active with that person because of the romantic attraction and connection that you have with that person. So that is something to consider. This can also, asexuality can be due to life circumstances or physical ailments. So asexuality can be something that results from a serious injury, can be something that results from possible injury to a sexual organ. It can be something that is due to life circumstances or violence that is done to you. These things can create that feeling of asexuality. Asexuality doesn't mean that they do not have interest in dating or relationships. So again, just because someone doesn't have that innate desire for sexual attraction does not mean that they A, don't have sex or have a sex life, and or B, don't want to have relationships or have that intimacy with their partner when they do have relationships. Pansexuality refers to having sexual attractions to individuals regardless of their sex or gender, a sexual attraction to all sexes or gender. That does not mean they have attractions to all people, because even if you have that would be like saying that all straight males have an attraction to every woman. That's not accurate, right? We still have preferences within the dating pool of people that would fit under there. Pansexuality refers to the fact that they do not narrow their dating pool by gender or sex, but narrow it by their other preferences for whatever it is that they're looking for in a partner. So this can be used as a way to debox themselves. So sometimes this is pushback to the system of boxes, right? If you know that you have a very fluid sex life, or that you feel like you're attracted to more of a person's spirit, or more of a person's personality, or more of a person's like commonalities with you than you are about their gender or their sex, then more likely this is a category that would feel more at home to you, generally because this is going to be more inclusive. It's going to like allow your options to be there, and it is more about the other kinds of desires or attractions that you have towards an individual rather than being based on sex or gender, if that makes sense. It means that they're open to more options and that humans are based on their other preferences. Again, reiterating that. All right, so we're going to talk about bisexuality and queer. Bisexuality has meant different things during different periods in time. It used to be a term that those who felt like they were pan more historically would use. It also is, so its definition in here is when such feelings exist for both members of one's own sex and members of the opposite sex. Again, we're talking about that sex binary, which is not necessarily accurate. So that makes the definition in and of itself inaccurate. For different people, it can mean different things. So it can mean that you have either two genders you're attracted to or two sex categories you're attracted to. So this could mean that maybe you're attracted to trans men and men, or maybe you're attracted to trans women and women, or maybe you're attracted to women and men, or maybe you're attracted to men and non-binary individuals, or maybe you're attracted to women and non-binary individuals. There's a lot of different variations that can be distinguished as bisexual, and that's a term that consistently has had a lot of different changes made to it within the community and within individuals who identify as bi. So if someone identifies as bi, that's a marker that they're choosing, and that can mean different things for them. That does not make them wrong in their sexuality or their terminology for themselves. It's just note that that definition particularly is one that seems to vary a lot by the individuals who utilize it. Queer is a label that is recognizes the fluidity of sexuality of someone who falls outside of the norms surrounding gender and sexuality. Again, this is a reclaimed term, but some still feel it is derogatory. So again, don't call somebody queer, but if they call themselves queer, that's perfectly valid, and you can use that at that juncture. Also, I will refer to the queer community a lot because queer is a term that in my community and in the community I am a part of is utilized more often than not. And being part of that community, that terminology is one that I use for myself. And thus I am okay with using. Again, that's a term that if you know somebody within that community, they need to use it first, and they need to be okay with you using it before I would use it towards somebody. Now, if you're going to talk about the fluidity within sexuality and you want to talk about queering, sexuality, rock that out, because queering is also a verb that means to differentiate or to be different, and that is okay. And queer academically has been used to describe multiple different spaces: queering gender, queering sexuality, queering just academia as a whole, queering oneself, and just acknowledging that I am different, that I am okay with being different, and that that's valid. So to be queer academically doesn't always have to refer to, and it's likely regularly not referred to as sexuality. That doesn't mean that when they label themselves queer, that doesn't also have to do with their sexuality. But just heads up, this is a term that gets thrown around in a lot of different spaces, and those spaces are going to vary how they use it. It can also be used to describe, again, that entire community, and it can be used outside of gender and sexuality, which I already mentioned. So last one here, and then we'll quit for this one, and I'll get into the second lecture here in a bit. So transgender or trans refers to people whose gender identity is inconsistent with their assigned sex at birth. And that's pretty self-explanatory. I will add that you can be trans no matter where you are in the in your, with or without any kind of transitionary material. So whether or not you change your name, whether or not you change your pronouns, whether or not you change any physical aspect of yourself, that does not make you any less or any more trans. That is an identity that you can accommodate and have accessible to you, no matter where you are in that process, or no matter if you ever do that process. Also, it is also an umbrella term that has been utilized for a wide variety of gender nonconforming individuals. And so trans, the umbrella term, has also been used for non-binary individuals, for folks who are considered gender queer, gender fluid. So there's a wide variety of individuals that could fall under that category. And so just a reminder that they need to be the ones to call themselves trans before anybody else does. And that if somebody comes out to you as trans, no matter where they are in that process, or if they want to do that process, it is their choice how they label themselves, and that needs to be validated and affirmed. So then we're going to get into the last term about identity for this week, and then we're going to get into some more theory-based terminology here in just a bit. But we're going to talk about polyamory. That refers to people who choose multiple relationships in which participants are sexually and emotionally bound to one another. Again, so some caveats here. That does not mean that they always sleep together, or that all parties in the relationship sleep with all other parties in the relationship. So you can have maybe someone who is in a monogamous relationship on one side of that triangle and in a very open side on the other. And or you can have three people where one sleeps with two of them, but the other two only sleep with that one, or they have other partners outside of that one that don't have to do with each other. This can have many different presentations. There can also be romantic relationships or sexual relationships. So you can have polyamory that is not based on sexuality, that is not based on sex itself, but more is based on romantic inclinations and or creating resilient, like maybe co-parenting or co-housing units or cohabitation practices. You can also, again, they can be more committed in these relationships, or those relationships can be more casual. You can have polyamory that is more about dating preferences and open relationships and open dating than it is about being monogamous. And that in and of itself can create a polyamorous situation. And this can also be, again, three people or a much more higher number, and can be very complicated very quickly to kind of delineate exactly how or how many this ends up being. And that's, again, up to the preferences of the individuals that are taking part in that, and the communication in which those individuals have with each other. So that's kind of that. We're going to get back out of here. I'm going to let you go for now, and then I'm going to come back and we're going to talk more about how we think about sexuality and kind of those mainstream issues with nature versus nurture. So I will be back shortly.